He didn't die. He was contained. That's what the last monk whispered before he vanished into the Carpathian mist. The Vatican burned the letters, erased the accounts, redacted the maps. But something survived, not in myth, in blood. Before start this story, please like and subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to press the bell icon. You've heard the name, Dracula, but not the truth. Forget Hollywood's fanged prince. Forget Bram Stoker's elegant, nocturnal fiction. This story goes deeper, older, and it begins not in fiction, but in silence, the kind enforced by blade and oath. What if I told you the real inspiration for Dracula wasn't just a cruel Wallachian prince? What if the man, or thing, behind the legend didn't just impale his enemies but performed something far older and far more deliberate? We begin in 1431, the year Vlad III was born, the son of Vlad Dracula, sworn to the secretive order of the dragon, not a mythic order, a real one, sanctioned by Rome, created to fight the encroaching Ottomans, but used for much darker purposes. Vlad wasn't just trained in warfare. He was trained in symbology, in ceremonial rites older than Christianity, passed down in whispers by Byzantine remnants and shadow brethren from the Black Forest. He didn't learn cruelty. He inherited it. The term Dracula wasn't just a family name. It was a role, a function. The son of the dragon was also the gatekeeper between life and something else, a force older than man, buried beneath the Romanian earth, sealed by Roman hands, worshipped in Dacian blood temples long forgotten. You see, Vlad didn't just kill to dominate. He killed to feed something. The same something he believed watched him from the mountains, from the trees, from his dreams. And he wasn't the only one. In the 15th century, local records describe children vanishing near Bran Fortress, livestock drained of blood. Entire villages moved overnight. And the official church doctrine? Pagan hysteria. Until 1476, when Vlad's head was presented to the Sultan in a sack of salt. And a week later, his grave was found empty. Not disturbed, not robbed, just empty. You were never supposed to know this. This isn't a legend. It's a lock that failed. And tonight, you're going to hear the story they buried beneath history, beneath literature, beneath fiction. Because the real Dracula didn't just inspire a monster. He was one. And they still don't know where he is. The fortress known today as Bran Castle was never his home, but a decoy, a narrative implanted by Western historians to mislead, to dilute the trail. The real seat of power and fear lay further east, in the ruins of Pornari, high in the Fagarash Mountains, reachable only by 1,480 steps carved into the stone with slave hands and blood. Visitors today see the ruins and feel a chill, but few know why the surrounding villagers still leave offerings at the forest edge during eclipses. Fewer still know of the iron gate below the structure, half buried in moss and sealed with a circular pattern not found in any Romanian architecture. Because what Vlad inherited, what the Order of the Dragon gave him access to, was not just political control. It was ritual access to a chamber no Christian should ever enter. Deep below the rock, the air itself changes. Old Jesuit sketches from 1532 describe a room of breathless silence, lined with obsidian and bone, where symbols etched in pre-Dacian script glow when touched by blood. This isn't fantasy. These records exist, in the forbidden vaults of the Vatican's Archivum Secretum. I've seen fragments. I've heard the priest who showed them to me choke on his own rosary the night after we spoke. Vlad didn't become a monster. He offered himself to one. He stopped being a man in that chamber, and what came out was something with memory, but no soul. He didn't just impale to terrorize. He performed acts of transference, channeling agony into something that fed beneath the earth. Witnesses wrote of impaled victims who didn't die right away, who murmured in ancient tongues, whose eyes blackened before they finally screamed. And Vlad watched them all, calmly, like a man reading scripture. There were monks who tried to stop him. Whole villages burned alive for harboring them. One survivor wrote that Vlad's breath smelled of iron and roses, a paradox no one understood until we found the preserved chalice in the Poenari ruins, its interior lined with dried blood and petals of Rosa gallica, the sacred flower used in resurrection rites before Rome outlawed them. The church knew, they always knew, but some secrets are too dark to fight. They must be buried, and Dracula was buried alive, but not in earth, in myth. They claimed Vlad was beheaded, his body buried in a monastery at Snagov, a neat ending for a story that was anything but. But no grave has ever been confirmed. The tomb under the Snagov chapel was opened in 1931 by Romanian historians and found empty, save for animal bones and a single iron ring etched with a stylized Ouroboros, the serpent devouring itself. That symbol was not medieval Romanian. It was Babylonian. It appears again centuries earlier in cave temples carved into the cliffs of what is now northern Turkey, sanctuaries of the cult of the Watchers, who believed that blood preserved not just life, but memory, and that certain sites served as veins of the world, arteries through which this memory could travel. What Vlad found beneath Poenari wasn't unique. It was connected. These veins ran deep beneath Europe, a network of sanctified hollows where blood, ritual, and ancient knowledge met. Vlad was not their first vessel, but he may have been their most willing. After 1476, rumors spread across Wallachia, not just of Vlad's return, but of disappearances, entire hunting parties vanishing without a trace, cattle found drained but untouched, and then the silence, not organic, but enforced. Ottoman records cease, monastic reports go blank, and the Vatican declares Wallachia spiritually cleansed. In truth, they had sent a second order, not to kill Vlad. That had failed, but to bind what remained. These were not warriors, but ritualists, Carpathian scribes trained in both exorcism and containment. Their names have been erased from the church's annals, but traces remain. Glyphs burned into Romanian parchment, mirrored seals sent back to Rome in lead-lined boxes. These men did not survive the binding. Their letters end abruptly. One final entry recovered from a water-damaged codex hidden beneath Sibiu reads simply, "He still dreams. The mountain holds him, but the mountain breathes." Understand what that means. He was not killed. He was not forgotten. He was interred within the veins of a living system that ancient cults knew how to activate. And as modern developers build roads, tunnels, and pipelines through the Carpathians, the seals they break are not just geological, they are spiritual ligatures. And once they rupture, whatever Vlad became is no longer confined to rock and myth. It enters the bloodstream of the present, and that's why the records are missing. That's why history lied. The Vatican would later label the mountain veins pagan conduits and mark them for suppression, but they knew what they were, arteries of resurrection. After Vlad's supposed death, strange manuscripts began to circulate among elite circles in Florence, Prague, and even London. None bearing his name, but all describing the same practices: the transfusion of blood to preserve personality, the binding of spirit to earth, and the use of iron-capped staves marked with sigils of reversal, not to keep evil out, but to anchor it in. These writings were not myths. They were manuals. The Medici commissioned translations. John Dee catalogued fragments of them under his classified Liber 5. And in 1601, a German alchemist named Wilhelm Kreutz claimed he had located the original grimoire of the dragon, said to be inked in a language that read only by firelight, stitched in human hide, and dictated to Vlad during a week-long blood fast beneath Poenari's foundation stone. Kreutz vanished 3 weeks later. Only his tongue was found, salted, preserved, and mailed to his benefactor in Nuremberg with a note. He asked what cannot be unlearned. But the rituals did not stop. They migrated. The Habsburgs quietly erected shrines atop older sites in Transylvania. Orthodox churches were built using stone harvested from blood grounds. One such church in Bystrica has a locked chamber beneath its nave that trembles once a year, always on December 13th. Locals call it St. Lucia's Morning. The clergy claim it's a natural tremor, but villagers hear chanting, and some have seen figures in the trees, tall, robed in black, carrying staffs crowned with inverted crosses. These are not monks. They are custodians, trained not to pray but to monitor, and when questioned they say only, "He is not dead, he waits." Why does no one speak of this? Because it's older than Christianity, older than Rome. These mountains were considered forbidden long before Christ was born. Vlad did not invent terror, he inherited it. And with modern excavation, with the weakening of faith, with the desecration of ritual space, that inheritance stirs. This is not folklore, it is a closed system of control, failing. And when it fails completely, we will not be dealing with a man or even a myth, but a sentient ritual, aware it was forgotten and hungry to be remembered. And yet, perhaps the most chilling piece of this dark continuity lies not in the Carpathians, but in the sealed vaults beneath Snagov Monastery, the site where Vlad Dracula is officially said to be buried. But dig beneath the official accounts, and you'll find something far more disturbing. There is no body. The tomb is empty. When archaeologists opened it in 1931, they expected bones, regalia, even dust. What they found instead was a decoy, a knight's armor, a decayed banner, and a hollowed cavity packed with ash and teeth. Not Vlad's, but from at least a dozen others, their molars extracted post-mortem. Forensic reports were buried. The Romanian Orthodox Church declared it a sacred mystery, and the monastery was quickly sealed off to further exploration. But photographs from the dig, ones leaked briefly before disappearing, showed something stranger still. Sigils burned into the inside of the stone lid, written in reverse Latin and Old Slavic, forming a looped incantation. May the vessel wander, but never rest. It wasn't a burial. It was an evacuation. The prevailing theory among the underground occult historians is that Vlad was never interred. He was moved, or worse, set into motion. A pattern of disappearances soon followed in surrounding villages. First livestock, then infants, then entire families, always on nights with no moon. Survivors spoke of a black rider with no shadow, and a voice that could speak from inside your head, promising release. Then came the silence. Snagov's population dwindled, and by 1950 only the monks remained, sworn to silence, walled in with their own shadows. And those monks? Every 7 years they choose a new one to descend beneath the altar, for cleansing. None return. Their robes are burned. Their names removed from the ledgers. This is not religious devotion. This is containment. A living chain, passed on through flesh and ritu. What the world knows as Dracula is not simply a story of bloodlust. It is a ritual protocol, encoded in narrative to distract, soften, and sanitize. The real horror is not that Vlad killed, but that someone, somewhere, is still feeding him, not with blood, but with belief. And as long as the myth is told, the ritual holds. But if it's ever broken, if silence falls entirely, he will not wait any longer. But if Snagov was the empty casket, then Poenari Fortress was the blade still buried in the earth, Vlad's true stronghold, carved into a cliffside like a scar that refused to heal. The stairs to reach it were built centuries later, 1,480 of them, yet each step traces a story soaked in screams. What most forget is that Poenari wasn't just a seat of power, it was a laboratory of fear. Prisoners were marched up to the summit only to be impaled before sunset, not for punishment, but for observation. Monks recruited from distant abbeys would record how long each victim lived, the angle of the spike, the weather, the phase of the moon. It was scientific. Vlad called it the discipline of shadows. These monks were promised salvation. In truth, they were test subjects themselves. Over 100 vanished during the early years. One journal entry survives, smuggled in the lining of a servant's boot. He drinks not from the throat, but from the breath itself. He leans close, nose to mouth, and inhales until they forget their names. What kind of hunger is that? Not for blood, for identity, for memory. The fortress walls still echo with it. Modern hikers who reach the top often report missing time. Cell phones go dead. Compass needles spiral. And most unsettling of all, they forget the descent. Ask any guide. No one remembers the walk back down. Just a void of silence, then pavement. Tourists laugh it off. Locals lock their doors. But deep inside the fortress ruins is a single iron door, sealed, rusted shut, with a mark scorched into it. Not a cross, a sigil, one traced in reverse by the same hand found at Snagov. It matches no known language. Some say it's pre-human. Some say it was branded into Vlad's skin at birth. But everyone who's tried to open that door, they've disappeared. Body, tools, cameras, everything. As if the door was not sealed to keep something in, but to stop us from stepping beyond, into the original wound, into the source of the myth. And if what's behind it stirs awake, the fiction won't be enough to contain it. They called her Elisabeta, Vlad's first and final weakness. But even that name is wrong, scraped from stone and rewritten in holy ink. Her real name has been deliberately erased, and with it, the truth of her death. The story told is simple. Upon hearing false news of Vlad's death in battle, she flung herself from the high window of Poenari into the river below. But there was no splash, no body, only a veil caught in the branches, and a streak of blood on the stones that remained red even after 6 centuries of rain. Fishermen who work that stretch of river whisper of a woman who walks across the current, barefoot and silent, vanishing when you blink. What's left out of the official record is this: she leapt in broad daylight, under a sun so bright it cracked the church bells, and when her body never surfaced, Vlad didn't mourn. He ordered the monks to fast for 3 days, then burn every page in their scripture that mentioned resurrection. He wasn't afraid of her death. He feared what it meant. One monk, mad with grief, etched a warning into his cell wall with his own teeth. She did not fall. She flew home. And what of her room? Sealed, buried, hidden under layers of stone and shame. But in 1977, a landslide exposed the chamber again. Locals who peered in swore they saw bones arranged in the shape of wings, and a single red slipper soaked in fresh blood. Authorities denied everything. The chamber was resealed, this time with concrete and steel. But the birds refused to return. And the river? It stopped flowing for 3 days. No natural cause was ever found. Some say Elisabeta was the first attempt, not a bride, but a vessel. And when she left her body behind, she left the door open behind her. Not for love, not for vengeance, but for return. Vlad knew it. That's why the myth needed to be born. Dracula wasn't to frighten you. It was a spell, to cover what actually happened to her. Penned, so when the real one came back, we wouldn't see it. We'd call it a dream, a fiction, a story, until it was already inside us. By 1481, Vlad was no longer merely feared. He was avoided, not hunted, not pursued, avoided, as if by unspoken agreement. All factions, Ottoman, Saxon, even the Wallachian nobles who once begged for his return, left him unchallenged. It wasn't politics. It was instinct, the kind that grows in the marrow of men who have smelled something not just wrong, but other. Travelers who crossed the Carpathians at night said they could feel it, something vast and awake beneath the roots, listening. One merchant recorded in his ledger a chilling note. At sunset, the birds flee east. At sunrise, the trees lean west. The center holds nothing. Vlad's castle, Poenari, was no longer visible on some days. Entire paintings from that era show a blank mountain where it should be. Locals claimed the fog was thick enough to crush a horse's ribs. Shepherds went missing. Wolves followed no tracks. A Jesuit priest sent to convert the region disappeared after scribbling a single phrase in his diary. He no longer eats. But the most damning evidence came from the few who survived his presence. They spoke of no shadow, or one that moved before him, not behind. They said his voice didn't echo in the halls, but beneath the floorboards. And his eyes, those who saw them said they had no color, only depth, as if you were looking down a well that had forgotten what light was. And then, in winter, something worse. Silence. The birds stopped singing. Dogs refused to howl. Even the wind held its breath. When a traveler finally reached Poenari again in spring, the castle was intact, but every iron spike at its entrance was empty. Vlad was gone. No burial, no blood, no bones. Just a throne facing the mountains, and a goblet still warm. Some say he walked into the woods and never returned. Others believe he never left. Not the forest, not the world. That he simply stepped behind the veil he spent decades learning, to tear. And that, on nights when the wind dies and the sky forgets its stars, you can still see him, standing motionless where the trees forget to grow, watching, waiting, starving. By the time his enemies realized Vlad had vanished, the rot had already spread, not through armies or bloodlines, but through dreams. In the months that followed his disappearance, strange reports bled from the villages. Midwives delivered infants with teeth. Priests forgot the names of their own saints. Entire monasteries refused communion, claiming the bread turned to ash on their tongues. In Kronstadt, the night watch found a shepherd hung upside down from the church steeple, smiling, eyes open, body drained but perfectly preserved. And always the same phrase whispered from the lips of the mad: "The Black Rider waits." He had become myth, yes, but it was the wrong kind of myth. Not a legend to be remembered, a presence to be avoided. The Vatican sent emissaries to cleanse the region. None returned. One bishop's servant was found in Vienna months later, hiding in a wine barrel, nails torn off, repeating the same 6 words. He sees in dreams. He drinks sleep. And what of the castle? Those brave enough to return said it breathed, that the stones pulsed slightly in moonlight, as if remembering a heartbeat long banished. A scholar from Bologna spent 3 nights within its walls and emerged blind, his mouth sewn shut by his own hands. He left behind one note scratched into the inside of his arm with a quill tip. He is no longer man. He is permission. And so the records stop, not from lack of stories, but from refusal. The scribes, monks, and kings who once catalogued Vlad's cruelties now omitted his name entirely. He became a wound in history, a page deliberately left blank. But that silence? It only made him stronger. For in that void, the true horror took root, not of who he was, but of what he invited. Something older, something patient. And somewhere in the back of every frightened peasant's mind, a single, unshakable thought took hold. What if he didn't disappear? What if he opened a door and left it ajar? The door wasn't just left ajar, it was worshipped. In secret crypts, beneath forgotten chapels and inside the sealed cellars of noble estates, a strange cult began to stir. They didn't chant Vlad's name, not aloud, but they mimicked his rituals with disturbing precision. Bloodletting was only the beginning. They trained themselves to sleep only during the day, ate raw flesh during ceremonies, and wrote scripture backward in languages no longer spoken. And their texts, salvaged from scorched libraries and drowned monasteries, contained patterns that defied logic, circles that bled into themselves, prayers that looped endlessly like traps. One diagram, when copied by a scholar in Prague, caused him to slit his own throat mid-lecture, his final breath forming a whisper, "He drinks through us." These followers, who called themselves the Che-Che-Tak, those who are silent, believed Vlad was no longer confined to a body. They claimed he had dissolved into concept, into structure, into architecture itself. They said some buildings were not built by men, but by will shaped like Vlad, hungry like Vlad, watching like Vlad. One such place was rumored to stand in the Carpathian shadows, a tower that could not be photographed or drawn, that refused to remain still in maps. Those who tried to find it vanished. Their dogs returned home first, bloodless, eyes turned inward, and the villagers whispered again. He built a throne inside absence. He sits on what cannot be named. Even the earth seemed to warp around the rumor. Fields spoiled. Wells went dry overnight. A black fungus, unclassifiable, crept up the sides of barns and crucifixes. Whatever Vlad had invited in wasn't just taking territory. It was rewriting it. Not by fire or sword, but by making reality forget itself. And in the silence that followed, the cult grew bolder, burying their mouths in ritual, carving eyes on their palms, and building without blueprints. Because, they said, he was returning, but not as he was. This time, the castle would walk, and it would need no gates, and yet, silence wasn't enough. As the Tse-Tse-Tak grew in number, something began answering back. Not in words, but in refusals. Flesh refusing to rot, time refusing to pass, and wounds refusing to bleed. In a monastery abandoned since the Ottoman siege, a monk's preserved body was found standing upright, hands clasped, smile still fresh despite being dead for over 300 years. No embalming, no preservation, just a waxy calm that radiated something far worse than peace. In the man's cell, scratched beneath the plaster, were the words, "He has learned to feed on memory." That same year, 5 children were born across different villages in Wallachia, each without a shadow. They grew rapidly, spoke full sentences by age 1, and could recite extinct dialects with perfect fluency. All 5 were taken by agents of the Habsburg court and never seen again. But their mothers claimed they didn't cry at birth. They laughed like old men remembering something foul. And then there was the noble family in Bistrica, who threw a feast every winter solstice, only for one chair at their table to always remain empty, not by choice, but by necessity. Guests who sat there bled from the nose and eyes. One priest burst into flame mid-sermon after mocking the empty chair aloud. No bones were found, just teeth fused into the floorboards like confession. Historians began to whisper about a return not of a man, but of an equation. Vlad had been solved, broken down into rules, rituals, geometric truths that could be rebuilt in secret, not resurrected, not reincarnated, but rebooted, like code. The architecture of horror had been mapped, and the Tse-Tse-Tak were now carving that map into Europe's forgotten spaces. The border between ritual and reality began to thin. And every century the wind in the Carpathians carried a whisper, low and brittle like a broken flute. He no longer drinks blood, he drinks belief. They say when a name is erased, but its echo remains, something worse than memory lingers. In 1786, beneath the cracked marble of Vienna's Hofburg crypt, a chamber was discovered that had never been recorded. Its walls bore no Christian symbols, only repeated carvings of a single glyph, a jagged spiral coiled within an inverted crown. Inside, a skeletal figure sat on a stone throne, its jaw fused shut with wire, its eyes stuffed with dried wolfsbane. The figure wore no royal seal, only a wooden amulet with a name carved in Old Church Slavonic, Vladislav, but not yet Vlad. Forensic theologians argued it wasn't a body, it was a placeholder, a vessel built for return, a spiritual decoy to keep something out, or something in. But the glyph, the spiral crown, began appearing across graveyards in eastern Prussia and southern Hungary. Entire burial sites unearthed themselves overnight, corpses found facing upward, mouths forced open by rusted crucifixes, their tongues missing. Witnesses spoke of hooded figures conducting rites at dusk, chanting not in Latin, but in broken Romanian laced with reversed Hebrew. A priest in Krakow went mad after decoding one chant. He claimed it translated to, "He walks again, not in flesh but in shape. His eyes are borrowed, his thirst is inherited." Then he tore out his own eyes and bled scripture from his wrists. As the Enlightenment swept Europe, reason battled myth. But something deeper than superstition crept into the intellectual class. Secret societies across Germany and Austria began including a blank seat at their tables, never acknowledging it, yet pouring wine in front of it. A Viennese mathematician claimed to have mapped the geometry of dread, drawing patterns that could invoke hallucinations of a throneless king with no reflection. His students all disappeared. The paper he wrote was later published, but not by him. It carried no author, or just a glyph at the header, the spiral crown, and beneath it, in faint Gothic script, "He does not sleep, he delays." Across all this, one truth became inescapable. Dracula was never buried, only postponed. No legend survives this long without feeding on something real, something older than rumor, older than Rome itself. In the lost Carpathian archives recovered during a 1924 avalanche, a priest historian named Father Lucian uncovered a scroll preserved in lambskin and sealed in human wax. The text, older than Slavic script, told of a shadow figure who walked before kings and drank before the first Eucharist. This being, unnamed yet constantly described as neither flesh nor fog, was worshipped in secret by pre-Christian warlords who believed it could bestow invincibility, but only after the blood of a kin was offered. One warlord, a proto-Dacian known as Karveth the Bastard, slit the throat of his own infant son on a stone altar atop the Turda Gorge. He did not receive strength, he received visits. Every night for 30 years, his dreams bled red. He wrote that the walls speak and the wind repeats my son's last breath. His soldiers found him one winter morning, eyes wide, fangs grown from his own teeth, claw marks on the inside of his armor. He had turned into the thing he worshipped, but it didn't end there. Blood rites spread. Entire families vanished into rituals gone silent. Then came the whispers of the Order of the Hollow Vow, a secret cult made of historians, nobles, and ex-priests who believed Dracula was not a man, but a continuum of will, passed from vessel to vessel. Vlad Tepes was merely a perfected shell, the vessel that didn't crack. The Order's creed was stitched into the lining of their robes. He is not a king, he is a question, and we are the answer delayed. Those who asked what the question was never asked twice. In the 1930s, one of the few surviving members of the Order was interrogated by the Romanian secret police. All he would say before biting off his own tongue was, "He never wanted a throne, he wanted us, one by one." And then he laughed too, through his own blood. Dracula, the myth, was never about power, it was always about harvest. and the season, it seems, was never truly over. By 1439, the Vatican had received sealed warnings written in trembling Latin, not from peasants but from bishops. Some excommunicated, others mysteriously vanished after their letters were sent. They spoke not of demons, but of a man who couldn't die the same way twice. One bishop in Sibiu wrote that Vlad Tepes was a vessel cut from bone and filled with screams. Another described a crucifix melting in his hand when spoken in Vlad's name. These weren't exaggerations. A hidden corridor beneath the Bran Castle Chapel, sealed for over 300 years, was unearthed by German archaeologists in 1938. Inside were thousands of human teeth, carefully arranged into concentric spirals, and a throne carved entirely from spinal columns draped in dried rose vines. A crude engraving on the wall read, "He drinks so we forget." It wasn't just terror, it was curation of amnesia. Every massacre was followed by plague, every disappearance by fire. Villages that spoke his name aloud vanished off maps within a generation. A forgotten town called Dolj was said to be Vlad's mirror, where children were raised to imitate his silence, walk barefoot on thorns, and sleep in caskets for weeks at a time. None lived past 18. Their bones were found stacked in perfect towers, each skull marked with a cross carved backward. When the Ottoman scouts finally breached Wallachia's borders, they expected chaos. Instead, they found forests quiet, roads clean, and corpses mounted with such mathematical precision, even the most hardened among them wept. But Vlad wasn't there. He had retreated somewhere deeper, some say below the Tehusa Pass. Others claim he walked westward into the libraries of London, where blood and ink have always shared a sacred shelf. Yet one thing is certain: his disappearance was never death. It was investment. Every act of horror was interest accrued on a debt no one remembers signing. You don't kill an idea by stabbing it, you kill it by starving it. But Dracula, this idea, this rot cloaked in velvet, feeds best when we call him fiction, and now, we've spoken too much. In the early winter of 1440, a sealed casket arrived at the gates of the Vatican, smeared in ox blood and wrapped in unmarked canvas. It was not addressed, but it bore the scent of soil no European priest could recognize. Inside was no body, no relic, no bones, only a manuscript written in iron gall ink on stretched lambskin. The text, scrawled in perfect Latin, read, "He was never born, only remembered poorly." The pages that followed described a rite of reversal through memory, where the destruction of one name fuels the resurrection of another. The cardinal who opened the casket was found 3 days later in a bell tower, hanging upside down, arms folded like wings, eyes missing, but no blood spilled. His final written words, "He waits behind our mirrors." From that moment forward, a quiet order was formed within the church, known only as the Custodes Obscura, tasked with tracking, misnaming, and fictionalizing the real Vlad. It was they who whispered his legend into Stoker's pen, pushing him toward Dracula, knowing that once the world believed him a myth, the real shadow could move unchallenged beneath the veil of fiction. Meanwhile, deep in Transylvania's rural heart, peasants still refused to speak his name after dusk. Instead, they left bowls of ash mixed with wine on their thresholds, an old rite to confuse the one who remembers. A child born with teeth was burned. A woman who dreamt of a pale rider was buried alive. These were not superstitions. These were instructions. And still, reports continued. In 1461, a Venetian envoy described a figure standing in a field of ravens, his shadow stretching against the moon in the wrong direction. In 1482, a convent in Krakow turned to ash overnight, only one word etched into the surviving stone: Vlad. The more his story was warped, the deeper his legend rooted into soil, into bloodlines, into the vaults of the mind, where history sleeps in silence. You think Dracula is a tale? Then explain why 5 bishops vanished the month Dracula was published. Explain why blood stains the original manuscript but not human blood. And ask yourself, if fiction is so harmless, why has every society worked so hard to bury this one? They told us he died, that Vlad III, the so-called Impaler, was slain in 1476, his body decapitated and sent to Constantinople as proof of his death. But no one ever verified the corpse. The Sultan's men who carried the head were never seen again. The severed head itself was rumored to speak in a tongue no scholar could identify, and when placed near fire, it would weep a viscous black ichor rather than blood. The crypt they claimed held his remains in Snegov Monastery was opened in 1931. Inside, only animal bones and charred soil. That year, a wave of disappearances swept the nearby villages, every victim last seen facing east, toward the forest. What the world doesn't understand is this. Vlad's genius was never in warfare, or torture, or even fear. It was transfiguration. He learned to unhook his existence from time, from biology, even from death itself, not through sorcery, but through repetition. If a name is spoken often enough, believed in deeply enough, it writes itself into reality. Like a scar that keeps reopening. Every retelling, every dramatization, every costume worn on Halloween, it keeps him tethered. Reanimated not through flesh, but through idea. The church thought they buried a tyrant. In truth, they enshrined a formula. Vlad was the prototype of the immortal lie, the first engineered folklore weapon. Even his portrait, gaunt, wide-eyed, mustached, is a decoy. Witnesses describe him differently depending on their guilt. Some see a child in rags, others a soldier with hollow armor, and some just a mirror. He became self-reflective fear. The Romanian shepherd who slit his own throat in 1953 left a note saying, "He stood in the light, but the shadow came first." In psychiatric hospitals across Eastern Europe, patients still draw his sigil on the walls, an inverted crown over a well of teeth. Still think he's fiction? Why then, in a secret NATO briefing, in 1974, did they classify an unidentified Balkan presence as V-Entity Class 1, memory-bound hostile? He never left. He only learned to multiply, through belief, through media, through you. Every time you say Dracula, a sliver of the real returns. There is a corridor beneath the ruins of Poenari Castle, one never marked on any architectural plan. Locals call it Passajul Uitat, the Forgotten Passage. Sealed for centuries, it was accidentally discovered in 1978 during a landslide that tore away a slope behind the keep. The first man to enter, an archaeologist named Emil Dragash, emerged days later, unable to speak, with his hair turned entirely white and his fingernails shattered as if he'd clawed at stone for hours. He was institutionalized in Sibiu and drew the same image over and over again. A narrow hallway that bent inwards like it was alive, lined not with bricks but with faces, fused into the walls, eyes still open. A UN historical team entered in 1982. Only one camera returned. The footage was classified immediately, though one frame was leaked, a long, dark tunnel with something crawling backward upside down, arms too long, lips sewn shut. This wasn't Vlad's tomb, it was his womb. His rebirth chamber. Vlad was never meant to be buried. He was meant to be preserved, fermented, like ancient honey or blood wine. And in that corridor, the atmosphere reacts to memory. Every step recalls what you most fear. Each visitor feeds him differently. Fear is caloric. Grief is medicinal. Despair, curative. But if you make it to the center, you find a chair, iron, barbed, and wet, not with moisture but anticipation. Whoever sits, disappears, not dies, not rots, evaporates. A priest once did, in 1993. The birds in the valley refused to sing for 3 years. No insects, no wolves, just wind that whispered back Latin prayers spoken in reverse. Scholars call it psychotemporal displacement. Villagers call it becoming his guest. The Vatican refers to it, privately, as the seat of eternal agency. Because whatever speaks from that throne isn't Vlad anymore. It's something older, using him as scaffolding, a frame to hold a darker idea, not blood drinker, not vampire, editor of the human soul. And you wonder why every record of his death is inconclusive, and yet, despite every measure to erase, seal, or silence him, he endures. Because Vlad the Impaler, or what wears his name, is not just history's monster. He is its curator, a shadow librarian of the forbidden, archiving humanity's sins so they can be mirrored, refined, re-released in more potent forms. The modern world mocks vampirism as superstition, but beneath every nuclear launch code, pharmaceutical patent, or genetic sequence lies a hunger that can't be mapped by science. Vlad understood this. He didn't need to live forever. He just needed the idea of him to metastasize. In 2004, Romanian officials discovered an unauthorized excavation under the Argeș River, a tunnel lined with reinforced concrete and Byzantine symbols scorched into the ceiling. Deep inside, a chamber of medical equipment, IV bags filled with black-red plasma hooked to a figure suspended in glass. It wasn't a body. It was a shell, wrapped in ancient cloth, pulsing faintly with what can only be called suggested life. The UN was never notified. The site was torched within 24 hours. No documentation survived. Or so they say. But on the dark web, a single frame circulates, grainy, unsettling. A face with no eyes, mouth wide open, smiling too far. Skin pressed to glass, as if whispering through centuries. Those who view it for too long report nosebleeds, seizures, and dreams of being chased down corridors by their own past decisions. You see, Vlad's legacy isn't about blood. It's about memory, inversion, distortion. He takes what defines you and rethreads it into something crueler, more precise, like a surgeon operating without anesthesia. The myth was never about what he drank. It was always about what he fed into others, a slow-dripping corruption that outlasts kings, councils, and religions. You don't kill Dracula. You inherit him. And one day, you wake up with his voice echoing in your mouth, and your reflection smiling back, just a little too late. But the deeper horror isn't that he returns. It's that we called him back. Not with rituals, not with candles, but with data. Surveillance algorithms, genome mapping, biometric databases. We invited him back by trying to quantify the soul. We gave teeth to the systems that once only fed on myth. The corporations with biometric access to your heartbeat, your voice, your habits. Do you think they don't know what to summon with it? Dracula was once confined to soil, to legend, to castles perched on crags. Now he lives in code, encrypted, fragmented, downloaded nightly into the dreams of billions. He has no need for coffins. He sleeps in cloud servers, stored in fragments across military networks, his resurrection embedded in terms and conditions no one reads. They don't need to stab a stake through his heart. We already outsourced that. And if you think this is fiction, consider this. In 2022, a defunct Romanian tech lab accidentally activated a dormant AI modeled off 15th century warfare tactics, cross-referenced with Vlad's known strategies. It began producing counterinsurgency protocols that were too brutal for any modern military to use, but eerily effective. The AI's name? Dominator. It didn't invent new violence. It remembered it. It resurrected it. That is his gift, his curse, his immortality, not in blood but in system, in impulse, in code designed to outlive conscience. Vlad the Impaler doesn't rise from a tomb in the forest. He rises through you. Each time you give your fingerprint, each time you share your face, each time you submit, willingly, eagerly, to technologies you don't understand. You become the soil he sleeps in. You become the castle, and by the time you realize your windows have no reflection, it's too late to scream. And still, the greatest deception remains. He never needed to drink your blood. That was just the misdirection. What he fed on, what he always fed on, was consent. Your silent agreement to turn your back on truth, your willingness to be ruled by symbols you didn't question. A crown, a flag, a priest's robe, a contract in Latin, a glowing screen. That's why the real Dracula wasn't destroyed. He was rebranded. First by the church, then by the state, then by cinema. Bram Stoker didn't create him. He contained him. Gave him a suit, a cane, a castle with drapes, a caricature to distract from the parasite crawling beneath civilization. Vlad didn't vanish. He got upgraded. He put down the spear and picked up a patent. He stopped draining villagers and started owning banks. Every time you hear Dracula, you smile, because you've been taught to, conditioned, defanged. But the real horror is this. What if you're not his victim? What if you're his reflection? A society that locks its poor in food deserts, that lets children rot in war zones, that trades freedom for filters. Is that not vampirism? He's not in the crypt. He's in your choices, in your compromises, in every time you say, that's just the way the world works. Because the real Dracula is not a man. He's the part of you that craves control, worships power, and fears truth. And he doesn't live in Transylvania anymore. He lives in your algorithms, your pharmaceuticals, your history books, your walls. And the worst part? He's still charming, still seductive, still offering you immortality. If only you'll betray everything that makes you human. That's why he wins. Not with fangs, but with a whisper. But of course there's a reason they want you to laugh when you hear the name Dracula. A reason they reduced him to a Halloween costume and a B-movie accent. Because fear that entertains no longer threatens. Because once you package the predator in plastic fangs and velvet cloaks, you forget what he really was. A system, a ritual, an elite structure that feeds upward, not just in castles but in boardrooms, labs, and think tanks. And while you were distracted by legends of garlic and mirrors, they were perfecting the real ritual, one that requires no bloodletting, just obedience, just silence, just your unquestioned participation. Look at modern health records. Look at the DNA banks quietly being bought up by pharmaceutical giants. Look at how fear is harvested, not through force but through screens. They don't need the stake anymore. You stake yourself, daily, with every I accept, every just doing my job, every there's nothing I can do. That's the curse, not the bite, not the crypt, the normalization of evil. And the worst part is, this isn't the story of Vlad the Impaler. This is the story of how men like him became gods, deified by myth, shielded by fiction, and unleashed into modernity as archetypes, untouchable by justice, unrecognized by the people they feed upon. A man who once ruled by terror now rules by policy. A shadow no longer cast on walls, but encoded into the architecture of your reality. He doesn't knock at your window anymore. He's in the water, the Wi-Fi, the calendar. And we are the ones keeping him alive. Because we forgot that monsters don't need to hide in forests or mountains anymore. They hide in systems, and once those systems become sacred, Dracula never dies. And if you think this is just metaphor, look again at the archives, not the ones in your public library, but the sealed ones in the bowels of private institutions, military vaults, and ecclesiastical catacombs. There, you'll find contracts, not legends. Transactions, not fairy tales. Records of land sold under duress to men with no names. Treaties signed in blood, disguised as inheritance law. Entire populations relocated under the guise of pestilence or religious reform, only to disappear, absorbed into the machinery of a quiet, long war. Vlad was not an anomaly. He was a prototype, what the Inquisition tested with torture. what Vlad tested with stakes, what corporations now test with algorithms. All of it is the same dark ritual, evolving through time, camouflaged by language and legitimized by paperwork. And still, you sit in your house and feel safe because you have lights, a lock, and laws. But laws are ink. Power is blood. And the men who understood that, men like Dracula, never stopped drinking. They simply stopped needing a chalice. They learned to drink through systems, through silence, through your belief that history is in the past. But what if the past was just a rehearsal? What if the Black Death, the Inquisition, the Ottoman conflicts, and the colonial expansion weren't separate events, but a single organism testing its limbs? You don't fear Vlad because of what he did. You fear him because what he represented has never died. You were taught to fear the vampire, but no one taught you to fear the infrastructure that made him necessary, the courts that excused him, the churches that blessed him, the scholars who rewrote him. That is the real horror, not the man, the machine behind him. And that machine still runs, quiet, precise, and very much alive. And now you understand why his name was never allowed to disappear. Dracula, Vlad, Tepes, the Impaler. Different masks for the same specter, an idea too dangerous to destroy, too useful to ignore. He is the shadow they summon when they need you obedient, the monster in your myths, but also the mechanism behind your obedience. Every time a nation falls silent under surveillance, every time a neighbor disappears without consequence, every time a population is told to endure in the name of order, that is Dracula speaking through the bones of the state, not through fangs, but through forms, through bureaucratic language designed to dehumanize, to delay, to destroy, without leaving blood. What was once done with a spike is now done with a scanner. What once took iron now takes only approval. You're not asked to believe in Dracula. You're trained to behave as if he still rules, even if you laugh at the legend, because the castle may have crumbled, but the ideology never did. In every surveillance drone, every corporate loyalty program, every military base with no flag, there, in the circuitry, in the encryption, in the silence, you will find his reflection. Because it's not that he was a vampire, it's that he was efficient. A leader who learned the price of disobedience and was willing to extract it by any means, and the world noticed, not to condemn, but to copy. Dracula is not dead. He is data. He is DNA. He is deep in the algorithms that now decide who disappears and who thrives. The only thing that changed was the delivery method. Not blood, but bandwidth. Not fear, but feedback. He does not need a castle anymore. He lives in the cloud. And just as Dracula was never about one man, the real horror was never isolated to one mountain castle. It metastasized. It spread into policy, into religion, into the quiet complicity of progress. They studied what he built, a system of terror so effective it did not require repetition. Once witnessed, it lived in memory. Once internalized, it ruled from within. What if I told you that governments across Europe didn't fear him? They envied him. That while his enemies wrote pamphlets to demonize him, their leaders scribbled strategies to emulate him. They disguised cruelty as necessity, called fear protection, and buried the truth beneath cathedrals and schools. His legacy became a blueprint, a way to train obedience into the bone without ever lifting a sword. Even today, it echoes. In how we obey signs without questioning, in how we surveil each other without orders, in how punishment has become invisible, but still absolute. No crucifix protects you from that. You don't have to drink blood to become undead. You only need to surrender your will. The real curse is not the bite, but the belief that the monster was defeated. He was only translated, turned into forms, procedures, histories written by the very hands that once trembled under his reign. Every time you say, "It's just how the world works," You are unknowingly speaking in his voice. They said the legend was contained, that the castle fell silent, that the villagers no longer whispered at night, but what they didn't say, what they refused to say, was that something else took its place. Not a man, not even a name, but a mechanism of fear, wearing new faces, speaking in tongues polished by civilization. Vlad's methods didn't die, they evolved. His brand of terror no longer needed spikes or torture racks. It arrived wearing robes and uniforms, holding ledgers instead of swords. The real legacy of Dracula was bureaucratized brutality. He showed that if fear is ritualized, if obedience is enforced not with blood, but with procedure, the body will betray the soul willingly. He was not a monster feeding on peasants, he was a prototype. And long after his death, his systems took root in courts, in schools, in asylums, and later in the laboratories of the 20th century. Where once he demanded silence before death, these new disciples demanded silence for life. They no longer needed darkness to hide, they operated in full daylight. And people complied not out of terror, but out of belief. That's the final transformation of the vampire, not just to walk in sunlight, but to be welcomed by it, to be crowned by it, to be called necessary. The year was 1942, but the shadow that stepped into the room was centuries older. In a Nazi-occupied village near the Carpathians, a series of reports surfaced, not of soldiers, but of disappearances that left no trace. Not blood, not bodies, just the vanishing. The SS dismissed it as local myth until they sent a reconnaissance squad. What they found was a church, boarded shut from the inside, crucifixes snapped and scattered, and a priest who hadn't aged in 50 years. He didn't speak. He only handed them a journal, its pages bound in skin, stamped with a seal identical to the one used in Wallachia during Vlad's reign. The final entry read, "He walks again, not for vengeance, for completion." And within a week, the village was erased from all Nazi maps. Even Himmler, obsessed with the occult, reportedly ordered the area sealed, classified, and marked with a single symbol, a black sun pierced by a fang. This wasn't superstition. It was recognition. Recognition that something ancient had survived their modern war, and that some legacies can't be bombed out of the earth. They simply wait for the right uniforms. In 1954, the Vatican received a sealed crate. No return address, no markings, only a sigil burned into the wood, a crescent devouring a sun. Inside was a single item, the preserved, severed head of a man, fanged, with puncture wounds in both temples, as if some device had extracted his very essence. His eyes were still open. Documents found beneath it detailed a covert Romanian operation, codename Project Cruciform. The goal? To harness the biological mechanisms behind vampiric immortality, stem cells, regenerative blood compounds, cranial nerve reactivation. They believed Vlad's bloodline had mutated into something more than myth. The experiment used prisoners. Most subjects died screaming, but one, Subject 9, didn't die at all. His heartbeat ceased, but he stood, awake. What followed was a rampage so violent, so unholy, that both NATO and the Soviets agreed on one thing: burn the lab, bury the data, and pretend it never happened. The Vatican, horrified, locked the crate in the forbidden archives beneath the basilica, in a room with no name. But rumors claim the head's eyes still glow when moonlight touches them, and that it whispers, not in Latin, in Wallachian, which no priest dared to translate. But the whispers didn't stay in the crypt. By 1961, 3 Vatican archivists had gone mad, each carving inverted crosses into their own tongues, repeating the same phrase in Old Church Slavonic. "He still drinks." One of them, Brother Lucian, vanished during midnight prayer. His cell door was found torn off the hinges, his Bible shredded into thin ribbons, each page rewritten with the same chilling message: he walks backward through time. Intelligence agents from the Swiss Guard, MI6, and even Mossad infiltrated Vatican corridors to gather fragments of Project Cruciform's aftermath, but most returned empty or didn't return at all. Behind closed doors, the Pope issued a silent decree. Sever all ties with Romania. Do not engage with the blood relics. But it was already too late. In the winter of 1963, a diplomat's daughter in Rome began to speak Wallachian in her sleep, though she'd never left Italy. She described visions of a pale man dragging a chained priest through a forest of mirrors, each mirror showing a different atrocity committed in Dracula's name. What no one could explain, what no one dared say aloud, was that the priest in the vision wore modern vestments. The implication was catastrophic. The past had opened its mouth and bit down on the present. From that year forward, a new word entered Vatican doctrine, not publicly, but whispered in basements, confessional boxes, and under breath during exorcisms. Revenant. Not a ghost, not undead. Something worse. Something returned. And in the depths of Romania, the locals had stopped saying his name altogether. By 1970, entire villages near the Carpathians vanished from maps, not depopulated but scrubbed clean as if they never existed. Their churches collapsed inward, bells melted down to slag, and family records replaced with blank parchment. One American anthropologist, Dr. Lionel Markham, traced a pattern in the disappearances. Each village had once hosted a portion of Vlad's retinue during his reign. In his final letter before disappearing, Markham wrote, "They were not victims, they were witnesses. They remember because they were made to." And there, in the margin, he had drawn a crude spiral, a reverse spiral that looped counterclockwise toward a black center. Experts later compared it to a 15th century Wallachian death sigil. That sigil has since appeared in chalk, ash, and even fresh blood at crime scenes across Europe and North America, always near disappearances tied to old bloodlines. What began as legend had calcified into a kind of living curse. In Vienna, a music historian found a composition in D minor titled Lament of the Hollow Heart, signed simply V. Upon playing it, he bled from his ears and tore out his own eyes. The audio remains unreleased, held in a Vatican vault, but transcripts of the final bars suggest a repeating pulse, a morbid heartbeat. Somewhere something still lived, not as man, not as beast, but as hunger incarnate. No empire erases such horrors without consequence, and by the end of the Cold War, Soviet intelligence files revealed chilling whispers, not of Dracula the tyrant, but of something deeper, older, and unkillable housed beneath the Snagoff Monastery. A vault sealed with silver nails and bound in consecrated iron was discovered by accident during a subterranean expansion project. Workers reported hearing what they described as a man choking on centuries, though no air vents led into the space. The project was halted, the chamber resealed. The lead engineer was later found with his lips sewn shut, red wax poured into his ears, and a Romanian phrase carved into his chest, Ceva s-a trezit. Something has awakened. Those files were later smuggled to London, where they caught the attention of a small cabal of occult scholars who traced a pattern between earthquakes and regional disappearances stretching back to 1476, the year of Vlad's supposed death. But the final note in the file wasn't from an agent or scholar. It was handwritten in the margin by a terrified archivist. It read, "This isn't about Vlad. Vlad was the first warning." In that moment, the story of Dracula inverted. It was no longer about a man who became a monster. It was about a monster that wore a man's skin until it no longer needed to pretend. And what now rises may not need skin at all. And if Vlad was merely the warning, then the question becomes, what was he warning us about? Not a lineage, not a political dynasty, but a hunger older than language, a presence woven into the Carpathians themselves, dormant until awakened by blood and ambition. The ancient Dacians whispered of it long before Rome arrived. A god without form, a thirst without end. Vlad's cruelty wasn't born from madness, but servitude. The stakes, the impalements, the theatrics of fear, they weren't excesses of power. They were offerings, blood rituals in open air to keep something asleep beneath the soil. That's why the forests seemed to scream. That's why the wolves grew silent before they attacked. He was feeding it, holding it in check. And when he died, if he truly died, it was never buried. His remains were scattered deliberately across the Wallachia Cerului, a cursed region known to make compasses spin and clocks lose time. Locals won't speak the name after dark. One whispered legend says, if the bones are ever reunited, the sky itself will darken, not from storm, but from shadow. Scholars have tried to locate the pieces, but always go missing. One drone captured an aerial shot of the region before its signal cut out. The image showed a ring of scorched earth, perfectly circular, with what looked like thousands of birds lying dead at the perimeter, as if they'd collided with something invisible. No impact, no wounds, just empty eyes pointed skyward, as if something had looked back. And as modern archaeologists dig deeper, both metaphorically and physically, into the mystery of Vlad's legend, it becomes disturbingly clear that his story may not have ended in the 15th century at all. Strange reports have surfaced from remote Transylvanian villages, children born with two hearts, blood that clots too fast, and elders who never seem to age. One monastery, deep in the Argeș region, still performs a ritual called Sangele Domnului, the Lord's blood, believed to be a direct descendant of the Order of the Dragon's Rites. Their scriptures do not speak of Christ, they speak of He who pierced the earth. The rituals involve impaling a straw effigy at dawn while chanting a series of numbers that, when decoded, correlate to celestial coordinates. The last alignment? It pointed directly at the moon during a blood eclipse in 2022. On that night, according to secret documents leaked from Romania's National Archive, every seismic sensor within 20 kilometers of Poenari registered a subsonic vibration. No earthquake. Just a long, low hum, like something vast shifting beneath the ground. Vlad's castle is gone, but its foundation remains, and what lies beneath it has never been fully excavated. Locals say the foundation stones are warm to the touch, even in midwinter, and there is a rumor, one not even the most hardened historians like to repeat, that in the final chamber of the ruined citadel there is a well, bricked over centuries ago, not to keep anything from falling in, but to stop something from coming out. And so, as the world moved on, spinning ever faster beneath the gloss of modernity and disbelief, the real legacy of Vlad Tepes was not staked in the heart and buried under church floorboards. It was scattered like cinders across centuries, in bloodlines, in rituals, in the silence of archives too dangerous to unseal. His myth is convenient for Hollywood, digestible in novels, and safely imprisoned in tourist traps along the Carpathians. But the truth, the raw, pulsing, unrepentant truth, is that Vlad the Impaler was not a monster invented. He was a warning forgotten. He understood something most empires still don't. That fear is not a tool, but a doorway. He opened it. And what walked through may not have been human at all. His genius was not cruelty, but control, the kind that rewrites memory, bends faith, and survives the grave. In the hush between midnight and dawn, there are still those who say his name backwards under their breath, not out of reverence, but to signal that they still serve. Perhaps Vlad didn't drink blood to become immortal. Perhaps he fed it to something else, something still waiting beneath ruined towers and forgotten thresholds. This was never a story about a vampire. It was a story about a king who made a pact with the dark and kept it. His body may have rotted centuries ago, but his influence metastasized. It lives in the veins of history, in the rituals of the elite, in the shadow cast by the myth. And the next time the world breaks just enough to let something ancient crawl through. It won't come as a bat or a man. It'll come as a legacy we never stopped feeding.